In today's webinar, we'll present results of a project collaboration between NIDIS and the Masters of the Environment graduate program at the University of Colorado Boulder. Noelle Crowley, Carly Doolittle, Josh King, Becca Mace, and Jonah Seifer will share with us today the methods and results of their year-long work on this project focused on drought risks and information needs of the outdoor recreation industry in the Intermountain West. Then Marka Hagenstadt will speak to us on the topic of how climate variability affects the winter recreation industry nationwide and the livelihoods of people who depend on this industry. Noelle Crowley is a graduate student at CU Boulder's Masters of the Environment program with a BS in Environmental Studies with an emphasis in marine biology from the University of Southern California. She specializes in sustainability planning and management, and her mission is to apply her research experience and problem-solving abilities to make a significant and positive difference in public lands management in Colorado. Then Carly Doolittle is a graduate student at CU Boulder's Masters of the Environment program with a BS in Natural Resources Management from North Carolina State University. Carly focuses on environmental policy. Her passion for the outdoors drives her professional goals with the goal of making a meaningful impact on the environment on those who have been unjustly impacted by environmental degradation. Josh King is a graduate student at CU Boulder's Masters of the Environment program, focusing on sustainability and environmental policy. He's interested in better management of outdoor recreation opportunities on public lands and rivers throughout the West. Josh holds a BS in Logistics and Finance from the University of Tennessee, and after spending 9 years in corporate supply chain management, he seeks to leverage his management skills to advocate for collaborative land management, increased river conservation, and responsible recreation planning. Becca Mace is a graduate student at the University of Colorado Boulder studying sustainability, planning, and management. She received her bachelor's in environmental studies and sociology at CU Boulder, and Becca believes that it is vital to examine how societal hierarchies have created a foundation that allows for ecosystem degradation and social problems to continue. She plans to contribute to the radical shift necessary to dismantle the link between capital power and decision-making and to connect social equity with environmental health. Jonah Seifer is a graduate student at the University of Colorado Boulder's Masters of the Environment program with a BA in Physics and Environmental Science from Colorado College. Jonah specializes in environmental policy, and he believes that sound public land policy and natural resource management is essential for the success of communities in the American West. This belief stems in part from his time studying Indigenous co-management systems in New Zealand. Jonah is pursuing a career as an environmental policy analyst. Finally, we're pleased to have Marka Hagenstadt present today. Marka is an economist with 20 years of experience consulting to both public and private sectors. She founded Circle Economics to facilitate the transition to sustainable and circular economy. She measures environmental, economic, and social impacts and progress in industries ranging from manufacturing to utilities. Much of her career is centered on economics of climate change, and she served as a contributing author to the latest UN IPCC special report, which was the first IPCC report to examine impacts to the farthest corners of the Earth, from the highest alpine regions to the deepest oceans. Ms. Hagenstadt earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and her Master of Science degree in economics from Utah State University. And with that introduction, I would like to turn the presentation over to Noelle, Carly, Josh, Becca, and Jonah.
Thank you so much for joining us here today. We're really excited to share with you the work that we've completed over the past year. Once again, the title of our project is Drought Risks and Information Needs of the Outdoor Recreation Industry. My name is Becca, and I'm joined here by my colleagues Carly, Jonah, Noelle, and Josh. So the overall problem that we examined is that while the outdoor recreation industry is a highly lucrative sector, making up about 2.2% of the national GDP, as drought is predicted to increase in both frequency and severity, the industry is left threatened and vulnerable. This is where our project fit in. We first sought out to simply learn more about the outdoor recreation industry through stakeholder interviews and surveys. We wanted to better understand how drought impacts this sector. With this information, we were able to relay the results back to our partners, as well as the stakeholders, to help mitigate the negative impacts of drought on the industry.
For the purposes of this project, we narrowed our scope to water-based outdoor recreation businesses in the Intermountain West DEWS region, which includes Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. We divided water-based outdoor recreation into 7 different subsectors: ski resorts, snow-based recreation, which includes activities such as snowmobiling, snowshoeing, dog sledding, etc., fishing, rafting, lake-based recreation, which includes activities such as stand-up paddleboarding and lake boating, and finally, small retailers that generate the majority of their revenue from selling gear that serves these aforementioned activities. In spring 2019, we conducted a literature review, which helped to ground the findings of our own research. We defined the scope of our work, which I mentioned on the previous slide, as well as developed our interview and survey questions, which served as the basis for our stakeholder engagement. During the summer, we traveled around the Intermountain West to conduct our interviews in person. Some of our interviews were also conducted over the phone. All interviews were recorded with permission from the research participant, transcribed, and then coded using linguistics coding. We also distributed a survey in July. This past fall, we analyzed all of our data. In November, we hosted a seminar here in Boulder, and in December, we completed our final report. So in total, we engaged 112 businesses. This engagement was relatively equitable across the 7 subsectors, but not across regions. As you can see from the figure on the left, we did the most of our engagement in Colorado. This is attributed to 2 factors. 1, due to our home location in Boulder, Colorado, it was thus easiest for us to travel within the state. And then secondly, Colorado has a high propensity of the different subsectors that we were interested in.
So taking a closer look at the stakeholders that we ended up working with, when we stepped back and looked at a bird's eye view, we found that there were 3 common characteristics of the different stakeholders. The first being that the majority of the stakeholders that we spoke with are small businesses. It is important to note that there is an exception to this rule, being ski resorts, as these can employ hundreds or even thousands of employees during the winter months. The next is that nearly all the businesses experienced some sort of short peak season. This means that they are bringing in the vast majority of their revenue during a highly concentrated time of year. For some rafting or fishing companies that we spoke with, this meant even as small as a 6-week window in the summer. Finally, the third is that seasonal employment creates different challenges. So because of this short peak season, these companies are forced to bring on additional employees in order to meet customer demand during that time. A couple of companies we spoke with said that they were having up to a 500% change in staffing during their peak season. So now really digging into the impacts of drought on the outdoor recreation industry. Before we do, it is very important to note that while the vast majority of the businesses that we spoke with said that they experienced negative impacts of drought, there were some exceptions to this rule that said drought actually was positive for them and that they were seeing an increased revenue and customer demand during a drought event. So the first environmental impact that we heard time and time again is low stream flows. So this is really impacting those river-based sports, so rafting and fishing primarily. This means that stream flows were so low in some situations that these companies were unable to operate on areas of river that they typically had in the past. The next is reduced snowpack. While obviously this impacts winter recreation, this actually has sort of a trickle-down effect as here in the West, snowpack turns into stream flow. So with a low snowpack year, low stream flows are expected to follow. This low snowpack can affect ski resorts, but primarily it's affecting those companies that operate on land that is not able to have artificial snow made. And similar to the rafting and fishing, sometimes they were unable to operate on areas that they had in the past. The next is warming temperatures. So the impact of this is really felt in the fishing industry. As with warming temperatures, river temperatures rise, and at a certain threshold, fish behavior changes, so the anglers are forced to react to this. Shortened seasons is another really important impact we saw. This kind of goes back to what I was speaking about on the previous slide, that with shorter seasons, these peak revenue times are getting shorter and shorter, and businesses are feeling more and more pressure to make up their revenue during other times of the year. And then finally, time and time again, we heard that the public perception of wildfire and drought could actually have a bigger impact on the business than the actual environmental impacts. So this means that even if conditions on the ground aren't as bad as the media or social media is saying, customers can choose, and often do choose, to take their business elsewhere. And it's also interesting to note that while the businesses feel the impacts of this during the drought event, they also noted that they were feeling this impact last through the following season as well.
In addition to environmental impacts, drought also creates economic and social impacts as well. Reduced snowfall and low stream flows generally serve to reduce visitation and purchasing, and business owners that we spoke with reported losing anywhere from a fifth to half of their revenue in a given drought year. Part of what's driving this is that consumers are increasingly tech savvy. They can monitor conditions over the internet and make last-minute decisions about where they go and what they do based on readily accessible information. So under these conditions, everyone's acting to minimize their risk, and we observed a transfer of risk from the manufacturer level down to individuals. Some manufacturers may seek to protect themselves and transfer risk to retail stores by increasing the lead time for orders, forcing those stores to lock in their purchase orders earlier. But if a store is faced with below average sales, a manager may transfer risk to individuals by laying off employees. We consider these drought-related layoffs to be a negative drought impact instead of an adaptation strategy, and believe that there's better ways to manage risk than these layoffs. Another social impact of drought is that it's contributing to widespread mental health issues among business owners. I invite you to read the anecdote on the bottom of the slide, as it's particularly illustrative of how drought can lead to stress in people. Many of these folks are usually in their given line of business because it's a personal passion of theirs, and their work means so much more than just a form of income. So as you can imagine, the prospect of losing that business is quite threatening, and that this threat is compounded by the additional stress of having to work harder and harder to capture every potential sale or trip, despite adverse conditions.
So as a whole, a lot of businesses have found ways to adapt in order to mitigate drought risk. The main adaptation strategy is activity diversification. Most businesses offer additional activities to their customers to reduce their reliance on either snow or water. This also extends their seasons and brings in additional revenue. Examples of this would be ski resorts that offer summer activities like zip lines, or rafting companies that also offer mountain biking trips. Next is spatial diversification. This is when companies operate in multiple geographic locations. An example of this would be ski resorts that consolidate across regions and sell mega passes, or when fishing and rafting companies run trips on different rivers. This helps reduce the risk of encountering drought conditions in any one specific area. Then there is also temporal diversification, which is changing the timing of services. This has been highly successful for fishing outfitters. They've changed the timing of their trips to account for warmer river conditions in the afternoon that may harm fish. Many outfitters that we spoke to even began offering early morning trips, often starting at or before sunrise. Marketing has also become very useful during drought years. Businesses are using social media and other outlets to reach out to customers ahead of their trips to adjust expectations. This keeps customers informed and updated on current conditions, especially when drought is in the news. And this can be very useful to fight any negative public perception of drought. Most retailers that we spoke to also adjust their purchasing strategies, which most of the time means buying less inventory in case it happens to be a bad snow or water year. And then lastly, an obvious strategy for ski resorts is snowmaking. And this is something that every resort we spoke to now does in order to maintain a quality customer experience and to provide a full-length ski season.
Despite a number of adaptation strategies being available to the industry, there are still barriers that make it difficult to impossible to adapt during drought events. In most cases, diversification requires additional capital and resources. Thus, it may be harder to diversify activities or where one operates for smaller businesses. For example, for fishing or rafting outfitters, new rivers often require additional permits, which have associated fees. For some businesses, these fees may be financially unfeasible. While an outfitter may be able to provide customers with different experiences during drought events, customers sometimes have fixed expectations and are hesitant or unwilling to change their experience. For example, while fishing outfitters can adapt to drought conditions by starting earlier in the day or shifting rivers, customers may not want to start fishing at dawn on their family vacation. As drought is expected to increase in both frequency and severity, particularly in the Southwest, businesses located in the Intermountain West will be increasingly impacted by drought unless they move their operations to a less drought-prone region. Many businesses said that although they are looking at forecasting resources, they don't trust the accuracy of these resources enough to plan their business around them. And then finally, many business owners did not see the clear linkages between drought and their businesses. They recognized the impacts of low stream flows and low snowfall, but were hesitant to say that it was caused by drought. These barriers as a whole make it challenging for business owners in the outdoor industry to plan for drought.
After spending the past summer traveling to states throughout the Intermountain West, interviewing stakeholders, we learned about the different impacts of drought on specific businesses and subsectors. After sitting down and analyzing our results, we as a team determined 5 themes that contribute to the overall vulnerability of the industry in relationship to drought. The first theme is the size of business. Though we spent most of our time interviewing small businesses, apart from ski resorts, we found that the smaller the operation, the more vulnerable they were to drought. This is due to limited capacity and capital. The next theme is related to elevation. This is mainly related to ski resorts and snow-based businesses. These operations located in lower elevation are more likely to be vulnerable because during a drought year, there's less moisture and therefore less snowfall, overall impacting the revenue of the businesses. There's simply no capacity to move up in elevation. The next theme is the distinction between businesses operating on free-flowing waters as opposed to those on or fed by tailwaters. Businesses on free-flowing waters are more vulnerable to the negative impacts of drought, we found, because they are directly reliant on the available runoff and moisture. And during a drought year, their overall revenue is impacted. Businesses on or fed by tailwaters are often buffered by dam releases, and even if there's drought in the surrounding area, this does not necessarily impact the water levels. The next theme is the importance of timing of the decision-making, such as hiring, procurement, and open and close dates. We heard examples from the retail sector that they often have to make decisions 9 to 12 months in advance, buying blind, as they said. Operations that have limited to no flexibility in decision-making are more vulnerable to the negative impacts of drought. The final theme is related to the length of season. Businesses that are operating on a short peak season, such as rafting, are much more likely to be impacted by drought because they do not have the time or ability to make up for the lost revenue, as opposed to those businesses operating year-round.
As an industry, businesses are using a variety of tools in planning their operations. This table ranks the top 5 resources per subsector, and we found that the most popular forecasting resource by far is something we've been calling experiential forecasting. Experiential forecasting is a category we created that encompasses the use of historic knowledge combined with personal observations to inform an individual's intuition. And what we saw is that longtime locals of an area can develop a very sharp intuition about local climate and weather, which is very cool, but not necessarily transferable to other business owners. The next 2 most popular resources are actually real-time monitoring services. The SNOTEL sites, which measure snowpack development, and the USGS stream gauges are useful in determining current conditions for trip planning and customer education, specifically in the river sport, fishing, and snow-based subsectors. The SNOTEL sites in particular also provide some insight about future runoff, which again is valuable to the fishing and river sport subsectors when planning trips. Next up, about 1 in 3 businesses are checking the long-range outlooks published by NOAA's Climate Prediction Office. Unfortunately, Most of these businesses expressed a lot of distrust in these outlooks, saying that they had limited accuracy and therefore limited utility. This might explain why about 1 in 5 businesses are checking the Farmer's Almanac. The Farmer's Almanac self-proclaims an 80% accuracy rate. However, independent verification says that this is much closer to 50%, which is about as good as a random guess. And finally, 1 in 4 businesses are using third-party forecasts. These are sites like OpenSnow.com, AccuWeather, or Weather Underground, and these resources are largely just reinterpreting or reanalyzing existing data and models. One particularly notable case in this category is a company by the name of Forecasts Unlimited. Forecasts Unlimited is a fairly unique case. We heard from a number of ski resorts that they could hire Forecasts Unlimited for about $10,000 a season, and in return they'd receive highly localized point forecasts at multiple elevation bands on the hour for the duration of the season. So clearly this is a premium service and it comes at a premium price, which makes it fairly inaccessible for most of the small businesses that we worked with on this project.
So common feedback is that the industry wants more accurate long-range forecasts. This will help business owners with procurement, trip planning, hiring, and equipment needs. For snow sports and ski resorts, they'd like to see better ways to forecast the upcoming season's snowpack. For river and lake-based businesses, while they also want a snowpack forecast, they're more interested in a tool that can translate that forecast into runoff quantity and timing. For retail businesses, better long-range forecasts will help them with procurement decisions that are often made 9 to 12 months in advance. Many businesses also mentioned that the current monitoring resources can be very complicated and difficult to navigate, and they're looking for more user-friendly ways to gather data about current conditions. A great example of this is the photo on the right, which is a weekly snowpack and streamflow report published by the Roaring Fork Conservancy out of Aspen. And while this is only for one particular watershed in one particular region, it's a great example of how multiple data sources can be presented in a user-friendly format. And so, based on all of our work over the past year, we've put together some recommendations for NIDIS. NIDIS is currently creating an outdoor industry page on the drought.gov website, and we recommend that they include subsector-specific dashboards that aggregate forecasting resources. This could also be a place to provide educational resources to help business owners understand the connection between drought and outdoor recreation. This could even be a spot to share popular adaptation strategies so that businesses can learn best practices for mitigating drought risks. Our second recommendation is to form working groups with the outdoor recreation industry. We hosted a seminar back in November, and representatives from the industry were able to provide great feedback on how NIDIS can better support them. And we think it's valuable to keep having these conversations moving forward. We also think it's important to engage with brands and manufacturers. In our project, we didn't get a chance to focus on the upstream portions of the supply chain, but those businesses are also impacted by drought in different ways. And then lastly, we can't assume that our findings are applicable in other regions of the country, since drought impacts businesses everywhere differently. So understanding how businesses adapt and mitigate drought risk in other regions may also be useful moving forward.
So we're going to go ahead and pass it on to Marka. Before we do, the 5 of us would like to extend one final thank you to NIDIS for all of the support this last year. This research was so incredible to do, and we cannot thank you all enough for this opportunity. So with that, we're going to hand it over to Marka, and then we will return following her presentation to answer some questions.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining, and thank you NIDIS and the CU Boulder Masters of the Environment team for that incredible presentation. Now I'm going to talk with you about climate variability and the winter recreation industry in particular. I'm sharing results of research I conducted along with Elizabeth Burakowski from University of New Hampshire and Rebecca Hill at CSU. We conducted this research for a study that was funded by Protect Our Winters and REI. And we sought to explore how variation in snowfall impacts winter recreation and what the economic impacts of that was. So we examined participation in winter snow sports and the economic contributions of that participation. We examined fluctuations in participation year to year and how variability in snow played into that, and then examined the subsequent changes in the economic contributions and explored options for adaptation. And the winter of 2015-16 was our study year, and we saw 23.5 million Americans participated in snow sports that winter. And the pie chart shows the breakdown of the various snow sports. So we can see, you know, skiing and snowboarding are the biggest ones, and the bulk of these activities are happening at ski resorts. And all of these recreationists spend money when they are doing these sports on their equipment, on traveling to do these sports, on any lift tickets that are needed or recreation fees associated with the activity. We found that skiers and snowboarders are spending around $159 a day, and snowmobilers just under $128 per day. So we took the expenditures and the participation data and entered that into a regional economic model called IMPLAN, and found the total economic contributions from those expenditures for the nation are 11.3 billion in value added. And those expenditures supported over 191,000 jobs nationwide with 6.9 billion in wages. And this is a definite underestimate of total snow sports contributions, as this just examined skiers, snowboarders, and snowmobilers. So this number would be much higher if we were able to capture the contributions from snowshoeing, cross-country skiing, all the other winter sports, and winter snow-based events such as ski races. And here are the state level contributions. We can see Colorado leads the nation at about 2.6 billion in contributions from those snow sports, and about 43,000 jobs are supported. California is the second highest, which is just under half that of Colorado's at 1.2 billion in contributions and 21,000 jobs. And on the East Coast, Vermont and New York together are about the same size as California. So while we noticed that participation in snow sports has remained relatively constant over the past 15 years, we noticed that the variability in year-to-year number of skier visits or skier days fluctuated considerably, from a high from over 60 million in 2008 and 2011 to a low of about 51 million in 2012. So you can just see that's pretty drastic variation in year to year. So we examined the set of factors that influence a skier's decision to ski and how frequently they may ski. And we found that it's influenced by snow and also economic conditions such as ticket prices and their personal skiing budgets. So we examined the relationships between skier visits and snow. We used SnowTel network data and found a strong positive relationship between snow or snow water equivalent and skier visits. So while skier visits between 2001 and 2016 averaged 55 million skier visits or skier days per year, we examined the 5 highest snow years and found that skier visits were 7% higher than an average year. And then the 5 lowest snow years were 10% less than average. So the low snow years had bigger decreases in visitation than the increases experienced in the high snow years. So it's not an even trade-off there. And then we looked at the economic impacts of this variation in skier visits. The high snow years added an extra 692.9 million in value added to the US economy and added 11,752 extra jobs as compared to an average winter. And then the low snow years experienced a loss of over 1 billion in revenue and a loss in 17,358 jobs. And here I wanted to highlight some of the differences across the states. So California had the highest magnitude in change in economic contributions, from an extra 175.7 million in their high years, but then a loss of 246.6 million in their low snow years. The state of Washington, they just had huge percent differences in visitation. Their skiers really responded to the amount of snow. And while Colorado, the percent differences were pretty small, the economic impacts were still very large, considering the total volume of skiers in Colorado is quite high. They have an average of 12 million skier visits a year. So a 2% increase on that led to a boost of 42.2 million in those high snow years, but then had an over 90 million loss in those low snow years. So looking forward, the temperature trends, the temperature increases will continue, and this is decreasing our snow accumulation. We're seeing a decline in the snow cover duration and the length of the ski season. And we're also seeing a decline in the snow water equivalent, which is the water contained in that snowpack. And this is also accompanied by less consistent snowpacks. So we're seeing seasonally episodic snow cover. So that's midwinter thaws, midwinter rain that melts the snowpack. So that's in addition to drought. If that temperature is decreasing, you know, for these winter snow sports, not only do we need the precipitation, but we need it as snow. And then the interannual episodic snow cover, we're seeing periodic bad years with exceptionally low snowfall. So for those of us in Colorado in 2018, we know that Western Colorado, that was extreme drought for them that year. And in the winter of 2014-2015 in the Western US, it was an extremely dry winter that was following 3 previously dry winters. The snowpack in the Sierras in April 2015 was just 2% of the long-term average. So this increase in variability and you know, these big economic fluctuations as skiers respond to the variation in snowfall just mean businesses really need to prepare for pretty wild fluctuations in their revenues. We're seeing a lot of feast or famine, and some resorts aren't going to be able to handle multiple bad winters. You know, all the resorts need to see how they can adjust and respond to these variations in their snow. So as the CU team mentioned in their presentation, businesses are taking action to reduce their vulnerabilities. They are reducing their own impacts on the environment. They're reducing their energy use, investing in energy efficiency, like they mentioned snowmaking. There's lots of opportunities there for reduced energy use with snowmaking. They're increasing use of renewables, reducing waste, encouraging transit for employees and customers. And encouraging transit for customers is really a big one because that oftentimes is the biggest carbon footprint of a ski company's operations, is their customers getting to their resort. The National Ski Area Association has some really great programs helping ski resorts take action. And then in addition to companies reducing their own footprint, they're finding they may actually have a bigger reach and a bigger impact by educating their customers. So we're seeing lots of resorts implementing education programs to increase customer awareness and action. And there's a new outdoor business climate partnership, which is a partnership between NSAA, the Outdoor Industry Association, and Snow Sports Industries America. And that is a group to have a collective voice, a bigger voice, supporting climate legislation and market policies. So these are all pretty new developments, resorts coming together to magnify their impact as they would have on their own with just one voice. And then in terms of reducing their own vulnerability, as we mentioned, increased snowmaking. However, that does require water and minimum temperatures, and also requires pretty significant investments. So the smaller resorts are definitely challenged in this area. The conglomerate resorts are really diversifying. We're seeing geographic diversification to ensure that some resorts, at least some resorts, have good snow in a given winter. Some resorts are changing dates of their operations, maybe opening later or closing earlier, or maybe just opening weekends for certain periods of times. And then a big one, as they also mentioned, is investing in other recreation options, such as mountain biking, indoor activities such as climbing walls and water parks, and definitely investing in special events and festivals. And then for recreationists, we're seeing they are also similarly reducing their own impacts on the environment, doing energy efficiency upgrades in their home, increasing use of renewables, and also having lifestyle changes, maybe changing their diet or using transit more. They are buying their products from sustainable brands. They're voting with their dollars, supporting climate action regulations, and supporting various environmental organizations. And then change in ski behavior. As we could see from the results of our study, less snow equals less skier visits. That's a pretty straightforward relationship there. And I also wanted to mention the backyard effect. For instance, if you have someone that lives in, say, Denver or Boston, and even though there's snow up in the mountains, we have seen that if they're not seeing snow as often in their own backyard, that they're actually skiing less, even when there is snow up at the ski resorts. They are buying these multi-pass resorts. They're waiting to book their trips, it seems, to see, who has the good snow before they book their trip. And then in the long term, I'd say it's somewhat uncertain how they're going to respond over time. If we down the road see fewer resorts that might be more crowded with more man-made snow, you might think that less people would decide to ski, but we're not exactly sure. And if the resorts are really diversifying their recreational options for their customers, then it's pretty likely that they're going to have some loyal customers that still continue to recreate. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone who's presented your excellent research. We really appreciate it. And I am showing here the contact information of everyone who just presented, as well as myself, at the bottom of the slide. And now we would love to welcome your questions. Again, if you have questions, please type them into the question box that's in the lower right-hand panel of your lower right-hand part of the control panel. And we have a few questions popping up here. I'll start with reading one, and then if others want to jump in with reading and answering them, please feel free to. One of them is, what are examples of positive impacts of drought on businesses?
Yeah, so this is most obvious with the fly fishing industry, where fly fishermen actually prefer fishing in lower water conditions because it's easier. So during drought events, when water temperatures are below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, fishing outfitters feel more comfortable bringing elderly folks and young children out, and therefore they can take more customers out. However, this reaches a threshold. So when water temperatures reach 68 degrees Fahrenheit or above that, this actually causes stress in fish and can result in major fish kill events, or just make it so that the fish are aggregating in the cooler portions of the rivers, and therefore it's not recommended to fish during these events because this could be long-term detrimental to the fish stocks.
Great, thank you.
So taking a look at the next question, did you feel, or did you get a feel for the accuracy of experiential forecasting?
Yeah, so experiential forecasting is kind of a broadly defined category, and maybe giving some examples would help kind of illustrate the accuracy of it. One example is of a gentleman who ran a snowmobile tour company, and he always had to choose where to send his trips based on snow levels. There weren't any snowtel sites in the area that he operated in, So instead of checking the traditional resources that we talked about, he had a favored snowdrift on a nearby peak. And if he looked at that snowdrift, he could basically see based on its size, oh, you know, this area has enough snow or the snow levels are too low, we need to go higher. Another example is of a fly fishing guide who would keep a really close eye on his upstream neighbors' irrigation ditches. And he could see that if the agribusinesses in the valley were starting to put water out on crops, he could experientially predict that his own river levels would go down. And as a result of that, basically could see changes in stream flow coming down the pipeline without any traditional forecast. He just could understand that intuitively based on the way that farming worked in his area. So accuracy is kind of tough to assess. It works because that's, you know, their personal observations over many years, which is perhaps why it's one of the more popular forecasting resources.
Okay, so the next question, what are some innovative adaptation strategies that you are seeing? So I think speaking from our experience over the summer, we saw a lot of the same adaptation strategies again and again, but some of the more interesting ones were using different partnerships. One business comes to mind where they, instead of offering discounts on their products during like Black Friday or Memorial Day or other major sort of shopping holidays, they were donating part of their proceeds to local nonprofits that were advocating for either public lands protection or climate change policy or something like that. That was a little bit interesting. We also saw some businesses that were actually speaking with their customers about the impact of drought and what they are able to do personally. I think those are the only ones that come to mind immediately. Let's see. One question is MARCA's written report available to the public? Yes, it is, MARCA. Do you have anywhere particular to direct people for that?
Yes, it's at protectourwinters.org. And if you search Protect Our Winters Economic Study, it will come up quickly.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Did you find that the size of business affected their ability to adapt?
Yeah, there was a pretty strong correlation between size and adaptive capacity. The ski areas are kind of on one end of the spectrum. They have a ton of capital, a lot of resources and people. Basically, when things started to go awry, they had the resources to fix that or to create new offerings or invest in snowmaking. The sort of other end of the spectrum is like the, you know, single-digit employee, hole-in-the-wall, small retailer that's not part of a larger franchise. We heard some pretty alarming cases, honestly, of smaller stores like that who maybe they had a large inventory or they were hit with a particularly bad drought event. And as a result of that, basically had to eat a lot of that inventory or absorb the cost of it. We heard some cases of people renting storage units to store old stuff. That was basically the best that they had to save it for another year. But the smaller off, the harder it is to adapt based on capital and resources.
So this next question, it looks like it's posed to you, Marka. What percentage of people identified as changing their behavior based on the backyard effect?
I don't have a percent for that. Sorry. Yeah, I would have to go back and look at the study, but I don't have a number off the top of my head. But it was definitely detected and researched. I think that was in the Northeast in particular.
Thank you. The next one I think is back to us. The team referred to forecast aggregation. How could this aggregation occur?
So on one of our slides, we showed an example from the Roaring Fork Conservancy, where they aggregated stream flow forecasts as well as snowpack. I don't have that in front of me, but that's an example of a dashboard that aggregates the various forecasts that different businesses find useful for planning their operations. And so our suggestion is to create a similar dashboard for the individual subsectors that we identified that is regionally specific, and again, aggregates those various forecasts that outfitters and businesses use to plan their operations.
This is a question directed at us again. For the state of New Mexico, does the region in this study include both Santa Fe and Taos?
Yes, we traveled to Taos and interviewed some 9-10 businesses in the area. We administered a survey to many more businesses, some of which were based in Santa Fe. So we essentially generalized the findings from those 2 large kind of recreation areas to New Mexico and the southern portion of the Dews region generally.
Okay. Is there any demand for insurance products which protect against drought impacts?
This is a question actually that we started asking later on in our interview process because it began coming up. And overwhelmingly, it seems that businesses aren't actually interested in insurance products. Similar products exist for the agricultural industry, which I think is why this question came up. But the outdoor recreation industry is notably different, and businesses feel that, for example, like a rafting outfitter, they already have to carry all sorts of other insurance, such as driving insurance, and then they have to insure for accidents, and so adding an additional insurance product is something that they're not interested in, even if it could be ultimately beneficial.
So we have a question here about the opposite extreme from drought. Particularly, this is a neutral year in the Northwest, which tends to generate some extreme conditions. We've seen it this season. Did you do any research about the potential for avalanches or slope stability for winter recreationists? I think I can answer this one, that this particular project with the Masters of the Environment students focused on drought and not so much on the opposite side of extremes. Mark, I don't know if your research looked at all at opposite extremes with avalanches and snow slope stability.
Right. No, since avalanches are mitigated at resorts, there might be situations where they need to close terrain to do those mitigation activities, or roads may be closed if there's, a canyon needed to drive through to get to resort. So in those instances, I think there may be some closures, but overall, we definitely found across the board that more snow meant more skier days.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Then we have a question here. I'm not sure who to ask to respond to this, but I'll just read it out. It has to do, I think, with the time frame of the drought and drought impacts that we're talking about. Whether consideration has been given to increase short-term variability as opposed to seasonal water supplies. So the time frame of where we're seeing drought, like if there's a flash drought, for example, versus the average seasonal water availability. So I don't know if any of the research projects looked at that, at the time frame of drought.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I think what we encountered in the field a lot was it was folks who were affected either by serial drought events. Maybe they have a retail store that sells ski equipment in the winter, and then they transition to, let's say, kayaks and river sport equipment in the summer. It's when those kinds of businesses are affected over the course of months and months. Do they really feel the impacts the most? I think those shorter, maybe the early season is dry, but later season is more average. I think that's less impactful than just kind of those long, drawn out drought events, even if they're not particularly severe.
So they can smooth out that short-term variability with the various adaptation approaches you talked about.
They can weather, a bad season, but not too.
Got it. Thank you. And
Yeah.
then we just have a couple minutes left. And again, for those who sent your excellent questions and we haven't had time to address them, we will follow up by email. But in a couple minutes, maybe you all could address this question quite quickly of what are some innovative adaptation strategies you're seeing? You've mentioned some of them. Maybe you could expand a little bit on those, or Marka, you could talk a little bit too on adaptation strategies.
Marka, do you have anything to add?
I would just say diversification is a big one for ski resorts, especially in the event of rain events. So just trying to find more indoor activities, and I've seen a lot of investments into beefing up summertime activities, even though they already have some summer activities going on. I've seen a lot of investment into more mountain biking trails. Mountain biking's been probably the biggest one that I've seen.
Great, thank you, Marka.
We got another one that I remember particularly strongly because we really only encountered this once, but there was a person running a retail store that specialized in skis. And they had a really unique rent to buy style program that essentially allowed them to, folks would come in for a season long rental, and at the end of the season, they could choose to pay, the remaining cost of the ski and keep the ski that they were renting all season. And we found this was pretty special because it not only gave customers essentially a discount on something that they were thinking of buying anyway, but it also allowed the store owner to clear inventory, which is really one of the pain points in the retail subsectors, when you have inventory left over from the last season that just won't sell for the same price in the future. So it was a pretty clever idea, this rent to buy scheme. It didn't take a whole lot of investment or even exposure to risk on behalf of the store owner. And it's kind of one of those great situations where everybody wins a little bit. The consumer gets a better price and access to gear, and the store owner gets to clear their inventory and still make money.
Great, thank you. Thanks for answering the questions, and thanks so much for your presentations. And everyone, thank you for joining us today. And again, we'll try to address your questions by email afterwards. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.